that's a huge, huge question. Has multiple answers. I think, thinking about that, because that question poses me, I think more than anything is that I see an area where we really have an imbalance in power, and that appreciative inquiry or that Aikido approach to conversations so that we understand each other is just not there, at least with our lawmakers and decision makers, the electeds. And I think that's something I'd love to have a national dialogue on, in terms of where are we, and do they really represent us, or do they really represent things that we're seeing that really don't have any benefit to us on a day-to-day basis. And so there, to me, is a real power inequity, a real injustice, I think, in terms of where this country needs to go and how it's being built.
The one for me that's closest to me is, and it's not so much a content issue, but it's about partisanship and how elected officials are no longer able to hear each other and work together for the common good. So for me, we're all sort of wringing our hands about what's happening at our state and our federal levels. I'd really love to see a national dialogue on civil discourse and how we can talk to each other to get things done.
It's probably a long one for me. There's just so many things right now that are fragmenting. It seems to be fragmenting our country. And I'm an American history teacher. You know, that's how I started. I went into administration later. So I've always been interested in history and government. I taught the subjects for years. And I know that there have been times in our past when we've been very polarized. The period before the Civil War was certainly dramatically that way. But there's something happening right now that's pretty disturbing. So, and I'm going to, just the example I would cite briefly, when I went to School Forest Service at Georgetown in the early 1960s, I worked at the U.S. Senate. And I had the early shift in the office, so I would go in early and I would go down to the Senate cafeteria for breakfast. In the corner of the cafeteria, we're usually seated, this is early in the morning, the majority leadership from both parties at a corner table, sitting and talking to each other. And that, I don't think if I were to walk back in the Senate cafeteria today, I would see that. And the whole idea that we do have differences, but you had an Everett Dirksen from the Republican Party who could recognize, for example, how important it was for the parties to make agreement on foreign policy. And some of the major civil rights legislation was developed that way. And there's a story in the book about Lyndon Johnson knocking on the door of the majority leader in the Senate, and I think it was Everett Dirksen at that time also, on some of the civil rights legislation. This was late at night. Dirksen got up and opened the door, and there was Lyndon Johnson with his two dogs and a bottle of bourbon in his hand. And he said, "I'm coming in and we're going to get this done tonight." So I think we've lost that. I think that the issue of polarization, to me, is critical, and I think it underlies serious problems we have with our foreign policy, our domestic policy, certainly our inability to come to agreement on a meaningful health care for this country is critical. So to the extent now that an organization like ALF can be part of encouraging or even establishing and implementing a national dialogue about how we can move past this, how we can learn to see things better from each other's perspective. In this sense that everybody has it all figured out the right way, and that I'm right and you're wrong, is not contributing to a healthy dialogue. And there needs to be some way that we can understand each other's thinking better and come to some consensus. So I'm hopeful the kind of dialogue that ALF encourages can be helpful in that direction.